The Warren-Matson Debate. Dr. Thomas B. Warren, Ph.D., is professor of the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics at the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Wallace I. Matson, Ph.D., is professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. This debate was held at the Curtis-Hixson Convention Hall in Tampa, Florida, on September the 11th through the 14th, 1978. We present the Warren-Matson Debate on the existence of God. The propositions for this debate are as follows. The first proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God in the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does not exist. Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the affirmative, and Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the negative of this proposition. The second proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does exist. Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the affirmative, and Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the negative of this proposition. This production was directed and videotaped by Dr. Rex A. Turner, Jr. and by Dr. Curtis A. Cates, administrators and professors of the Alabama Christian School of Religion, Montgomery, Alabama. This film has been copyrighted and reproduced by the National Christian Press, Incorporated. Any reproductions, use, or sale of this film without written permission from the authorized representative of the National Christian Press is strictly prohibited.
Gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Dr. Matson assured us at the beginning of his speech, and I want to say this in a kind and friendly way, but nevertheless I want to say it firmly. He assured us he didn't know anything about evolution, and then he felt as if he had to prove it. So he went right on and did it. Dr. Matson, your field is philosophy, and showed you and explained it to you, proved it to you, that we do not discover the origin of life by any specific scientific discipline. I challenge you to show the single scientific discipline that proves the origin of life. Find the biologist that can present the argument, the sound logical argument, the conclusion of which is, therefore I know that human beings now living on this earth owe their ultimate origin to evolution from non-living matter, from rocks and dirt, if you will. Did he give that argument? No. Dr. Matson was actually debating himself all through this with this meandering that he made. And Dr. Matson, I don't mind your giving little dissertations on history. I rather enjoy history. In fact, I have sort of halfway majored in history of doctrine, but that doesn't have anything to do with what you're supposed to be doing. Your field is philosophy. I made my arguments in a philosophical way, and you should have responded as a philosopher. I pointed out last evening that what has to happen in the question of the origin of man, so far as you're dealing with disciplines, is this. Even though scientific disciplines realize this, that when you take information from biology, then from chemistry, then from paleontology, archaeology, physics, and so on, and then you draw down that information in an effort to synthesize it, that is not science. That is philosophy. The synthesization of data from the various scientific disciplines is philosophy. And Dr. Matson, that's what you ought to have been doing, and you ought to present the argument precisely. Premise number one, premise number two, conclusion. Show the argument's valid. Show the premises are true. Did you do that? You didn't even try. You didn't even try. Now, I said a moment ago that you were debating yourself. I call your attention again to your book, The Existence of God, page 128. Finn Pasteur showed conclusively that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation. Now, he said, well, Pasteur wasn't concerned about proving evolution to be false. It doesn't matter whether he was or not. What you said he proved and what he did prove is there is no spontaneous generation of life. Now, if there was a beginning, even according to your own alleged situation, of there being nothing but non-living matter, and there is no spontaneous generation of life, will you pray tell how by evolution life ever got here? But that's not all of his statement. He went on to say, all, not just some, but all living things are generated from seed. Now, Dr. Matson, I'm going to give you a kind and loving challenge to take your own book. I'm going to leave it right here for you, and I want you to read this statement and explain it to the audience to fit with the speech you just made. Will you please do that? Now, you know, Dr. Flew really quit about the middle of the first night in our discussion. Dr. Matson quit last night, and he stayed quit tonight. But he did really try on till about the third night. If we have somebody that'll stay on and really try all the way through the fourth. What we've just listened to here was really no reply whatever to the affirmative speech that has been made in this situation. All this he's had to say about Aristotle and Darwin does not contain one precise argument that even claims to be valid, much less to be sound. Now, Dr. Matson, I'm going to give you the challenge. Here it is. Will you please take the data from all of the writings of Aristotle or Darwin or whomever you wish to choose, now living or dead, and formulate the precise argument, the conclusion of which is, therefore I know that human beings evolved from non-living matter, that life came from that which had no life, and that human beings came from that which were not human. However many difficulties you may say there are in identifying whether something is or is not human, it still remains that everything that has ever existed or that now exists is either human or not human. Dr. Matson, in harmony with the law of excluded middle in logic, answered a question previously in this debate, in the written questions. Every precisely stated position is either true or false. Now, that's the law of excluded middle as it applies to propositions, to statements. But that isn't all there is to the law of excluded middle. It also has application to objects. What does the law of excluded middle say as to objects? It says that every object either has a certain property or it does not. Everything, let us say X exists. X either has the property of being a rock or it does not. X either has the property of being black or it does not. X has the property of being human or it does not. Now let's picture Dr. Matson's situation. He claims, he has to claim that matter is eternal because if there was a moment that there was nothing, there never would have been anything. If there had just been nothing, no God, no matter, nothing, nothing would exist now. He's got to claim eternality of matter. He's got to claim eternality of non-living matter. And then he's got to come to a place where non-living matter turns into life. For the sake of our argument, though I do not believe it, but for the sake of argument, it's counterfactual for me. Let it be 100 trillion years back out there of non-living matter. There still has to come this moment of time when there is in this moment, time t sub 1, no life. In the next split second, there is life. How did it come about? Dr. Matson says no spontaneous generation. All, that means every single one without exception, all living things come from seed. Seed have life. There had to be seed before all of these living things that are now living. From where did the seed come? Exactly where the Bible says it came from God. God formed man from the dust of the earth, breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and man became a living soul. I want you to note then in connection with this speech that Dr. Matson's admission, no spontaneous generation, all living things from preceding seed. He does not talk about the mechanism of evolution. He does not talk about the how. He wants to talk about the when. Way back in history, wants to give us a discourse in history, which has nothing whatever to do with this. Dr. Matson, you can dispense with all of that, however entertaining it might be for all of us, and tell us how that which had no life came to live, and that which was living but was not human came to be human. You cannot solve your problem by just saying nature has no leaves. My friend, if you're true, there is the change of something here in one split second is non-human, and in the next moment it's human. Somehow or other there's something that's not human, and then in the next instant there's something human, whether it's by birth or transformation, and you've already given up both of those, unless, like so many other things, you want to take that back because you're only kidding about it. Dr. Matson, you ought to get a sign or have somebody to hold up a sign that says he means this statement, and then have somebody else to hold up a sign when another statement and say he doesn't mean this one. There is no fossil record which supports evolution. Dr. Matson, I challenge you to give it. There is no actual geologic column in the world. It is only a fabrication of various men who hold the atheistic position. They must have evolution to fix it. So here is what happens. In some cases, even upside down from what it's supposed to be. They involve themselves in circular reason. How do they know how old the rocks are? They measure the rocks with the fossils and the fossils by the rocks. That's like saying, is A true? Yes. How do you know? Well, B is true. But how do you know B is true? Because I know that A is true. You see, all that he said has nothing whatever to do to get him out of the problem of the eternality of matter, which is false. Life from non-life, which is false. Human from non-human, which is false. All right, thank you. And we don't deny that change occurs. We don't deny that some things have lived and gone out of extinction. There are even some things now in danger of going out of existence. Why, we even stopped a dam, or had the government stop a dam in Tennessee because a little minnow might go out of existence. But would that prove that human beings came from rocks and dirt? If 1,000 years from now there were no snail darters up in the at the Tellico Dam, would it, Dr. Matson? He says that everybody agrees, all the scientists agree the world is very old. Dr. Matson, there are scientists who don't agree with you, who have just as good scientific credentials. There is no argument he's given. There is no real documentation. There is no valid sound argument. Some things have disappeared, so what follows? He hasn't given any argument on that. Incidentally, Dr. Matson, are you aware of the fact that there are dinosaur tracks and human tracks in the riverbed of the Biloxi River at Glen Rose, Texas? What about considering and discussing that for us? Dr. Matson said he didn't know anything about evolution, and he proved it, and I suggest, Dr. Matson, that both you and I get back to discussing these matters from a philosophic basis. We can take information from the scientists, but let's discuss it as philosophers. Did not prove life from non-life. Darwin did not prove human from non-human. Darwin did not prove the human cardiovascular system by evolution. Darwin did not prove human sexuality from that which had no human sexuality. I dare you to try to formulate from Darwin's writings a precise, logical, sound argument, the conclusion of which is that I know that man, with all of his intricate cardiovascular system, his digestive system, his eliminative system, his reproductive system, have come by pure blind chance from non-living rocks and dirt. Well, friends, that takes care of that if ever a speech was taken care of. And I've been in a number of these, and if ever I felt that anything had been destroyed, I've destroyed that. Now back to my speech in the affirmative. All right, thank you. I want to turn again to chart 68N and continue, in spite of the fact that Dr. Matson does not wish to discuss these matters and their implications. I am on the fact of the matter that God is and God is just. In chart 68N, we have shown you here the law which rises above the provincial and transient, the law of England. Dr. Flew and I discussed that. He's an Englishman. He recognized that English law had no jurisdiction over the Germans. I recognize that American law had no jurisdiction over the Germans. Upon what basis, then, were those men tried, convicted, and some of them executed, and some put in prison for life? Because we recognize that there is a higher law, a law that is objective, a law that pertains to right and wrong without regard to what any of us think about it. Now, let us go into the argument concerning the human conscience. Chart number 19. This is a continuation of my affirmation that God is good. If at least a human being actually has a conscience, and the conscience is that within man which urges him to act in harmony with that which he is convinced is right, as Paul indicates, the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, referring to the law written in the heart, the conscience bearing witness therewith, and the thoughts either accusing or else excusing. There is the conviction of man as to what is right and wrong. There is then the God-given faculty of urging a man to do what he is convinced is right. Dr. Matson answered questions tonight that shows that he has a conscience and recognizes its objective, obligatory nature. Now I'm saying if at least one human being actually has a conscience, and if that such characteristics as have originated only with God, then God exists. Secondly, at least one human being actually has a conscience, and that conscience has such characteristics as to have originated only with God. Therefore, God exists. It was because C.S. Lewis, a former atheist, came to the realization he'd gone along for years thinking, I can't believe in God because of this or that or the other, while all the while he was talking about, it ought to be this way, I ought to do that. He then recognized that there is a higher law, just as I've been talking about, that the conscience within urges us, that we ought to do it. Now, oughtness cannot be taught. Usually, atheistic philosophers say, well, all the conscience is when you spank your child, don't play with a goldfish, and you give him a spanking. If he does, well, then he won't do it anymore. All you're doing there is teaching him that if he does it, he's going to get a spanking, but that doesn't teach him oughtness. That has to be given to him by God. This is a God-given faculty. As we noted at chart number 19A, when an individual sees of a drowning person in a river, there is the conflict within his mind of a need for survival of himself. He's afraid if he goes in the river, he may drown. There is the desire to save the person, a sense of oughtness. I ought to do it. A child burning in the upper story of a building, a ladder in the yard. You know if you put the ladder up, the building may fall in. You want to run away and save yourself, but you say, I ought to save the child. That's something more than just somebody giving you a spanking. It is a recognition of something greater and higher than ourselves. It is an oughtness. And so we realize we ought to try to save the child. What ought one to do when need conflicts with desire? When you come to a cross in the road to make a decision, and you're convinced that this road is right and that one wrong, your conscience will urge you to take that one. But if you take this one, then afterwards your thoughts will accuse you and say you have done wrong. Dr. Matson has admitted to Now let us go of God. As I look at the justice of God, we find in the Bible, in regard to the severity of God, and this is simply another way of referring to his justice, his holiness, righteousness, that he cannot tolerate sin. As Paul, in giving the basic theme of the book of Romans, after saying that he was ready to preach the gospel, the great message of good news to those at Rome, he said, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel," and he assigned the reason. "For it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is revealed the righteousness of God from faith unto faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." Men attain unto righteousness, freedom from sin, by the gospel, by the power of the shed blood of Christ. And that because of the righteous demand of God that we be free from sin. That God, being the infinite God that he is, not only infinite in power and knowledge and presence, but infinite in justice, that he cannot tolerate sin. And we have no platform from which we can stand to evaluate the enormity of even one sin. What ought to be the just results of sin, unless God would tell us. And God has told us. He has told us by the price it takes to get us out of it, the gift of his Son on the cross, and the price that it will take if we lose our soul, the retributive punishment, what we will deserve, the wage of sin that we have earned, according to Romans 6:23, to be separated from God in everything that's good once and forevermore. Paul says in Romans chapter 11 in verse 4, the goodness and the severity of God, and he made clear the goodness of God is toward those who will hear and obey him, and his severity, his justice, if you will, against those who reject him. Notice in chart 36, Y1, the whole case that Dr. Matson had here, and how I could pray that he would, that there is no conflict. Maybe if he could see this one point, he would see then that God does exist and turn in repentance to become a Christian. All of us, whether we're religious or not, must recognize the Bible. Christianity is the religion of biblical authority. And how I could wish that Dr. Matson would recognize not only God, but the Bible be his word, Jesus Christ, his Son, and that there is no conflict whatever, there is no incompatibility between the love and the goodness of God and the severity of God. I could not worship God if he could tolerate sin. If, like wicked drunkard fornication, a fornicator or murderer of the street, who out of his drunkenness and having been on drugs would fall in the gutter in degradation, could simply tolerate any and every kind of action. A person would say, it doesn't matter to me how degraded you are sexually, how degraded you are in lying or not telling the truth. To tolerate that is to be not good. That would then be a conflict between the goodness of God and the justice of God. The justice of God demands the punishment for sin, that he cannot tolerate sin. We could not know what the justice or what that punishment ought to be if we did not have the revelation of God. But we're discussing here tonight the existence of God, not the details of all of Bible teaching about it. Now then, the results of atheism are terrible indeed. In Romans chapter 1, verse 18, after Paul had made clear that the evidence of God is right before the eyes of everyone, his everlasting power and divinity are made known by the things that are seen, he then showed in regard to those who turned away from God, 3 times in that chapter he said, wherefore God gave them up, in giving a list of the terrible and heinous crimes that were committed. My brethren, our nation, our educational system, our very well-being in this nation is being jeopardized by the doctrines that are being taught by such men as Dr. Matson in our state colleges and universities and schools.
As much as we enjoy visiting and talking about the proceedings, I must call us back to order in order for the debate proceedings to continue and stay within a reasonable portion of time. We continue to have inquiries about the tapes and about the book. Again, emphasize this for the sake of some coming in late who may not have heard the announcements in the beginning. The tapes will be ready within 30 days, we're told. There is order blanks for the tapes. As you exit, or if you'll see some of the ushers, they'll be glad to provide you with this. There's also an order blank for pre-publication price on the book. Carefully read the instructions on this because there is a time factor involved. So you need to get the order in as soon as possible. In addition to what is taking place this week in our debate here in Tampa, Ray Mooney, speaker for the national weekly radio program presented by the Druid Hills Church of Christ in Atlanta, Georgia, a program entitled Insight, will interview Dr. Warren and Dr. Matson for the Insight broadcast. Insight is carried over some 156 radio stations. The program will be a 2, possibly 3-part series. We encourage you, if you're interested in this, to consult the local listings in your area where you may live in order to see when this would be aired. We now turn the floor back to Dr. Matson.
Dr. Warren has not brought up anything to which I have not already fully replied, except some vague talk about conscience. I will continue with my amateurish exposition of evolutionary theory. I think I might as well say that I regard it as a great impertinence for Dr. Warren to tell me that I have no right to talk about evolutionary theory or biology when he himself treats us to so many charts about it. I presented in my last presentation the kind of evidence for evolution that was available by the middle of the 19th century, by which time it had accumulated to such an extent that no serious student of the subject had any doubt that evolution had occurred. The only question was how. It's important to notice that Darwin's fame really lies in his being able to give a satisfactory account of how evolution occurs, and not that he thought up the whole idea from the beginning. The theory that existed before Darwin was that of the French biologist Lamarck. He saw that there is evolution. He tried to explain it by saying that in every organism there is an innate drive to perfection, and that organisms evolve because the given individual acquires certain characteristics and passes it on to his descendants. That is, to take the stock illustration, giraffes have long necks because there were some short-necked giraffes who, however, by reaching for leaves higher and higher, lengthened their necks. They simply stretched them, and the baby giraffes from these giraffes, had longer necks, and so on. He also thought that spontaneous generation is rather frequent. The difference between Darwin and Lamarck, and why we are Darwinians and not Lamarckians anymore, is this: not that there was no disagreement between them about the fact of evolution, or about the gradualness of evolution also. Geology was beginning to give a time scale sufficient to accommodate the gradualness necessary to account for the very complicated forms such as us. Where he differed was that he thought there was a common descent of all life. This was a kind of intuition that Darwin had, a common descent from one or at least a very few proto-ancestors of all living things. That is, in the phyla at least, say all present-day insects. There are thousands and thousands of variations, probably can be traced back to one original insect. Well, insects are not a phylum, but I told you that I'm just an amateur. He thought that all animals have this common descent from ideally just one animal, but at most 5 or 6. And he explicitly said that this includes man, which of course caused a great outcry. Darwin's great claim to fame, though, is in his propounding and acquiring cumulatively overwhelming evidence for a mechanism of natural selection, a mechanism of evolution, namely natural selection working upon spontaneously arising variations in a population. As I explained last night, what evolves is not the individual, as Lamarck thought, but the gene pool, the interbreeding population. Darwin's idea was that variations arise in this pool from unknown causes. They were unknown to him, but he demonstrated their existence. That is, the fact that there are variations, though he couldn't explain them. Some of these will be disadvantageous. The individual who has them will be handicapped in the struggle for survival. Other of these variations will be advantageous. He'll have a head start on his competitors. Those who have the head start will tend to have more descendants. More of them will reach breeding age proportionately, and they will have more descendants. So the gene pool will be traced in the direction, will be a change in the direction of those who have variations that are more conducive to adaptation to whatever kind of living they have to get in the world. That gives a satisfactory account of how we can get from very primitive organisms to very complicated ones. It gives in particular a satisfactory account of how we can get from simians or primates of one sort or other to man. Neo-Darwinism, as it's now called, is the union of Darwinism with the science of genetics. And this is important because the science of genetics explains what Darwin was unable to explain, namely the origin of variation in a population. This science is founded, as you all know, by Gregor Mendel and gives the mechanisms of inheritance. Mendel had to postulate the gene, that is to say, the actual mechanism for passing on a trait in inheritance. But with the discoveries of Watson and Crick, it was found possible directly to observe and indeed to chemically manipulate the gene. As you all know from reading your newspapers, this has become suddenly a rather practical problem. So, when you have Darwinism giving you the mechanism of evolution, namely natural selection on a population that is varied, and genetics giving you the mechanism of variation, plus a lot of smaller steps which nevertheless are important, such as the rather recent discovery that there is a greater degree of variation in individuals of the gene pool than had previously been thought. And something else, radioisotope dating. I talked in my previous presentation about dating by the fossil record and the strata, which Dr. Warren, in his usual sober scientific way, ridiculed. That, fortunately, is not the only method of dating that we have anymore. We have radioisotope dating. I can't explain everything. I will not go into what that is, which changes the previously accepted dating, which was, after all, very much dead reckoning, with really quite precise figures. Though nothing in principle is changed, that is, it has not been found necessary to invert any of the previously established geologic eras or anything like that. in general, it's been found necessary to stretch it out a bit, which is, of course, an advantage to evolutionary theory. It gives you even more time. Well, all right. Neo-Darwinism gives to all competent investigators of these matters a thoroughly satisfying explanation of the evolution of the life forms we have with us today. There are others that I will mention for the sake of completeness. There is the theory of pre-formation. I associate this with a man named Gross, though I don't think he was the originator of it. This was the theory held, I think, in the middle of the 19th century, that the creation of the world indeed did occur in 4004 BC, as Archbishop Usher had calculated, but God created all the strata with all the fossils already in them. This view, I don't think, has any further adherence. Then fifth, this was a new one to me, I just heard it a few minutes ago, the fabrication theory, that all this is simply invented by wicked scientists who are seeking to lead good Christians astray. I have heard of similar theories. For example, the view that the earth is really flat and shots taken from orbiters of the earth and so on are fabrications made by the scientific clique that's interested in deceiving us all. I really did not expect to encounter that, not even after what else I've encountered in this series, but there is just no limit to what you can find if you wait long enough. A general overview of conclusions that are now accepted within the scientific community. The age of the Earth is 4.6 billion years. The origin of life came about a billion years later. It can be dated, apparently, to 1 1/10 billion years, or 1,100,000,000 years. A fairly short time after the formation of the Earth. Multicellular plants and animals, that is, creatures that have more than one cell, only 570 million years ago, we had to wait a tremendous long time, almost 3 billion years after the beginnings of life, to get past the limit of one cell and to start on multicellular things. That is, the most advanced organism on Earth for 3 billion years was something like the amoeba. Mammals come only 200 million years ago, and then less than 1% of the era of mammals sees what we can recognize as men. If Dr. Warren presses me on this point, okay, Homo erectus, who was human, arrived on the scene, what's today, September 14th? September 14th, 1,800,000 BC. Does that satisfy you as a precise answer, Dr. Warren? And preserves the wonderful law of excluded middle. The use of fire by these creatures has been known for less than a third of their overall lifespan, namely 500,000 years. Neanderthal man, who is essentially similar to modern man and could doubtless interbreed with him, 100,000 years ago, of extremely short time, a snap of the finger or less when you're dealing with figures of this magnitude. And agriculture, and consequently civilization as we know it, only 1/10 of that time, 10,000 years. Now, it's the question that I've been asked again and again, or challenged about, though I'm not supposed to talk about biology, the question of how life could have arisen from non-living matter. First, I will quote from my own book, which has been thrown at me. I've lost track of how many times. Quote, thus, well into the 19th century, biologists commonly divided living things into those that were generated from seed and those that were spontaneously generated. Then Pasteur showed conclusively that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation. All living things are generated from seed. I don't have to take anything back here. I didn't bring this. I notice that I providentially used the present tense here. He showed conclusively that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation does not go on in our time or in Pasteur's time. If by spontaneous generation here is meant the development of something that we would recognize as having life, namely some cell that reproduces itself, from inorganic components. Life originated in this way 3.5 billion years ago in the form of what are called anaerobic bacteria. Anaerobic bacteria, some of which still exist, so we can study them in the laboratory. I mean, they're no big deal. They've gone on all this 3.5 million years. The word anaerobic, as Dr. Warren recognizes, being a Greek scholar, means airless. They are bacteria who are immediately killed by contact with oxygen. Among them are such things, well, I won't say what are among them. Anaerobic bacteria, if they were generated now, would immediately die because there is oxygen everywhere and it would immediately kill them. They can only arise in an atmosphere that is oxygen-free. But the atmosphere of the Earth 3.5 billion years ago was, happily, oxygen-free. The oxygen in the atmosphere comes from the breaking down of water and carbon dioxide by plants by photosynthesis. This is a much later stage of development. I am not making this up or theorizing at random. The actual processes by which this came about are largely understood by actual laboratory experimentation, namely the famous experiments of Urey at Chicago, in which he passed sparks through a flask containing gases which approximated the composition of the primordial atmosphere. And when he analyzed the tars that sank to the bottom of it, lo and behold, there were recognizable, quite large quantities, really, of amino acids. Amino acids are well known as the building blocks of all living things, from the anaerobic bacteria up to us. Nobody has yet duplicated in the laboratory the step from the amino acids to the anaerobic bacteria. I'm sure Dr. Warren will triumph that that means that it can't be done, and so on and so forth. And I don't know whether it will be done in his lifetime. It took a billion years on Earth since the soup, as it's called, from which all this started, began to be formed as soon as the Earth got cool enough to have oceans. From amino acids is a fairly small step to the polymerization of amino acids into protein chains. From there on, it is, in a way, all downhill, although there's much detail to be filled in. As I said, this is a careful and very carefully worked out cooperative enterprise of untold thousands of dedicated men and women. And I don't think it's something much to be shaken by the sneer that I have got to explain how a monkey mother could have a human baby, or at what moment a monkey out on his walk became human. Thank you very much.